Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable on the domestic policy of the US. We decided to call it Deciphering the US, Identity, Narratives, and in the plural, and identities in the plural. This will be the subject of our discussion today, to see what are the plurals today of American society and in what way it constitutes a disruption or a continuity in American history. I'll try to be fairly quick in my introduction. The aim is to leave as much time as possible for our distinguished guests to present their point of view. In the last 30 minutes of the roundtable, we will have some time for questions and answers with the room, with this Slido platform. So don't hesitate. On the side of the room, you have QR codes, which will enable you to ask questions to each of the participants throughout the roundtable, and then they will be shown up on the big screen. So I'm very pleased to be here with you once more as a part of the SMED. Very interesting session today. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank you, first of all, to the speakers for being present and for agreeing to participate in this 4th edition. To give a quick panorama of the situation within the United States, we've been able to see since the beginning of the 2025, at the beginning of the Trump's second term, a complete reorganization of the political scene in the US. And I would say for our part, as Europeans and French people, we look at this with great puzzlement and concern and fascination when faced with the internal situation within the United States. I think that this return of Trump in January 2025 confirmed the social, cultural, and institutional polarizations that are taking place within the US. Far from being a temporary turbulence, they represent the symptom of a sustainable and long-term transformation of the country. On this side of the Atlantic, I think it's high time to stop seeing US as a spectacular sideshow, but we need to look at the important role of the democratic institutions. This reflects our own problems here in France and in Europe. The aim of this roundtable is to decipher these movements and the underlying trends taking place within the US in 2025. Before we hand over to our speakers, I would like to give some context, 4 or 5 ideas to begin our conversation, and then we'll start our discussion. The first idea that I would like to mention is perhaps the most profound, which is the polarization of American society and the increase in political radicalization. On the 10th of September, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, one of the most emblematic representatives of Turning Point USA, completely accused of hijab evil in American society. Trump called him a martyr for American freedom. This assassination, in my opinion, crystallizes the fusion between religion, ideology, and politics. In addition, in parallel, we saw many attacks against American elected representatives, in particular many Democrats, who at the local level were attacked or threatened. The FBI, in particular, published a report in July 2025 giving alerts about the increase of internal extremist groups, including in the pro-Trump sphere. What this shows from me is the increase in the institutionalized political violence, which has become normal, with conspirationalist rhetoric, and also a spiral of political violence, where over the last 6 months, more than 150 incidents have been recorded. relating to ideology or partisan action. The second element I'd like to highlight is, of course, the ideological offensives in particular sectors, particularly in education, against public freedoms, and also within the army, and the phenomenon of culture wars. There has been a multiplication of censorship laws in several states, such as Texas and Florida, with a ban on certain contents that are considered too woke and the withdrawal of history books that talk about slavery or civil rights. And how can we not talk about the recent declarations by the new Secretary of Defense, Peter Hesketh, Secretary for War now, who is drawing up a new doctrinal approach with a complete change in the doctrine for the military institution by eliminating diversity, equality, and inclusion approaches, and banning beards, and promoting the highest masculine norms as the requirement for physical condition. This reveals instrumentalization of the memory and identity policies, and also a hardening of policy in the public space. The third idea is economic fracture, the development of poverty, and the increase in inequalities in the American society. We've been able to see over the last few months that there have been many ideas of tension and increase in unemployment in the U.S., particularly among young populations. There have been many strikes in the public sector, many strikes and trade union mobilization in big companies such as Amazon and Starbucks, and in the automobile industry, whereas the Trump II government has remained completely hostile to any increase in the federal minimum wage. Finally, the last point I would like to highlight, which for me also is particularly important with the approach of 2026 and the midterm elections, but looking even further ahead for 2028, is the electoral reforms which have taken place in the US and the barriers to participation in elections. In many states, we've seen a further restriction in participation in elections, particularly in Texas, Georgia, and Florida, with the reduction in mail voting, the closure of certain polling booths in certain districts, and a purge of the voting lists in many counties. This represents a return to a strategy with restriction of the voting rights, which is nothing new. In America, this took place in the 20th century and looking forward to the midterms of 2026 and the next presidential election in 2028, this represents a narrowing of voting rights. Without any further ado, I'll now introduce our three speakers on this panel, and then we'll move on to the questions.
So the furthest from me, I have the pleasure of welcoming Amy Greene, who is a Franco-American and specialist of American politics and working for the Institut Montaigne. She works on cultural and economic fractures and between rural America and conservative America, also racial conflicts and divisions within the United States. Amy Greene takes a keen interest in memory, culture wars, and identity polarization. She often writes in French media and has written two books, one in 2012, Post-Obama America, and her latest book, America Faced with Fractures, which was a finalist for the FMES Prize of 2025, which you'll be able to find on sale outside this auditorium. I have the pleasure of welcoming Marco Scioli, who is a professor of history at the University of Milan and is one of the greatest specialist in Europe of the United States political history. He is an expert in constitutional thinking and American foreign policy. He works on the construction of American power, what supported it, and American exceptionalism. And I also welcome Cole Stangler, who is an American journalist based in France, in Marseille. He regularly writes for The Guardian, France 24, The Nation, and he is especially interested in the working culture in the United States and social fractures. He is professor at Aix-en-Provence University. He is also the author of a book on American anger, where he analyzes deindustrialization, precarious work, and marginalization of the working classes. More recently, he published an inquiry, an investigation on radicalization of the right, cultural fractures, religiosity, and the erosion of the left-wing electorate, working class electorates. It will also be found for sale outside this auditorium. I thank the three of you. Thank you for agreeing to take part in this panel. Thank you for your participation and your support to this organization. And we will start with a first question, which is a fairly incisive one, to give some background. According to you, what is the recent event which best crystallizes the American situation, and what event signals a rupture or breakaway or a continuity? Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. To come back to one event, I would like to come back to the murder of Charlie Kirk, which represents a continuity of political violence in the United States, which is nothing new. There are a lot of precedents of political violence in the United States, even with the assassination of presidents. Nevertheless, there is a particular spike in violence, and in my book I talk about violence against elected representatives, not necessarily particularly highly visible representatives, but simply at a local level. And this started in 2017 with threats against members of Congress, which was doubled. You quoted a few other examples. The elected representative of Minnesota, who was murdered at her house together with her husband, and several other attempts in other states. So we see that there is this dynamic going on. And a few months later, on the 17th of September, the murder of Charlie Kirk, an ultra-conservative activist. And I'm taking this example because I think it represents a certain number of phenomena in the United States, and it is very revealing. On the one side, we see this violent dynamic reveals an acceptance of violent actions in politics, with a small minority of Americans who consider that violence is legitimate and justified to exact political justice in an ecosystem in the United States where you tend to see your political opponents as a real enemy, even as an existential threat. When your opponents are perceived as existential threats, violence can never be far away as a possibility. At least it becomes in the realm of the possible. There are other aspects, I think, which also reveal what's happening on a deeper level in the United States. First of all, they're the reactions. So we have violence from above and also from below. We see that there are political leaders who are instrumentalizing their political position in order to encourage violence against all different kinds of people. And from that, we can see that we have entered an era where political leaders are monetizing existing fractures. And what we see is that they are feeding into this culture and then this violent dynamic from below. Someone decided to shoot Charlie Kirk. He wanted to exact justice against Charlie Kirk by his own actions. And we see through the responses and reactions in social media, very varied reactions. We saw jubilation, celebrations, justifications. We're saying, well, it's someone who had said hateful words, and so we cannot deplore his death because it is his murder is only a consequence of what he has said throughout his life, the fact that he was pro firearms and so on. And so there was not a universal condemnation of this political violence. And we can see that there is inability of the political institutions to put an end to this violence, and quite the reverse. You have part of them who actually encourage it. And then among the population, people who consider this a perfectly legitimate possibility. So for me, this event is in the continuity of a long history of violent events and the extension of a discourse from above, which encourages violence, and also the discourse on social media, which also encourages violence. And this also revealed a generational fracture or fault line. I looked in social media and I was able to see these fault lines, and we saw that the older they were as Americans, the more they would consider that it is not at all acceptable. Either it's always unacceptable or often unacceptable to celebrate the death of an opponent. But the younger the people get, the more you get in terms of acceptance of this type of action. And that is really interesting, because we can conclude from this that older Americans have lived through political experiences in perhaps a polarized world, but less so. And so they have the experience of being confronted with difference, to look straight in the eyes of your opponent, to say that you disagree with them and argue about it. And then we see that there is a generation on social media without any civic education, and they are living out their citizenship in these hermetic environments. And that can contribute to explaining these phenomena. And so I think we're going to a more and more macabre trend. And I think this event summarizes a lot of very evident fault lines in the United States. Thank you, Amy. I will take away from this this normalization of political violence with the bottom-up and top-down versions of political violence, and thanks in part to social media, and which is part of a continuity and not so much a breakaway. And what you were saying also made me think that not only was there a debate within the United States, but even just a few weeks ago, the same discussion was held within the European Parliament about whether or not Charlie Kirk should be remembered. And shows the resonance that issues of interior policy, domestic policy in the United States can have on the rest of the world.
I will choose another example in particular. South Carolina judge's home was burned to the ground after issuing rulings against Trump administration. It was a wonderful home, very close to the seaside. I was in Savannah last year with a long trip from Chicago through Kentucky, Tennessee, North and South Carolina. It's okay. And what I noticed is this great fracture between the two parties and what they represent. White supremacy and hegemony from one side, the side of the Republican in red, red also the cap, and on the other side, the Democratic Party, which carry on values well expressed by the Joe Biden administration: inclusion, solidarity, and also equity. Everywhere in these southern states, saying, vote for Trump, no wall, no jobs, only violence and drug. It was not true. If we consider the global unemployment rate in the US during the Biden presidency, it was at 4%, and now this is today's rate is moving up. And then also the same happened for inflation. You can imagine how much is an inflation in the US today. You can pay $5 to have just a coffee, really bad coffee. By the way, Trump administration and the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who changed the name in Secretary of War, created a fear against the Democratic Party and the so-called woke culture, accused to be violent, especially after the death of Charlie Kirk. Just listen to the Vice President J.D. Vance. We are trying to figure out how to prevent this violence that you see from the far left from becoming even more and more mainstream. Corey Robin, author of the book Reactionary Mind, one of the insightful books you can read on the Trumpist right, and what is behind it. It is clear in denouncing this blue fear. They stressed the theme on the immigration, out of control. But both Trump and Vance are married with an immigrant woman, one from Slovenia and the other from India. But they are against immigration. For the Republicans, the immigrants are the problem. For the Democrats, they had always been the force of the nation, starting from the first Treasury, the first Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. To carry on these politics against immigration, was the President Trump who referred first to the Alien and Sedition Act, just a little of history, in 1798, during the John Adams presidency, the second presidency after George Washington. The fear of the French Revolution and the new immigrants from Paris, and you remember that one of these immigrants was that is Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, that is designed the capital, Washington, D.C., and the other is a figure that I studied a lot, that is Edmond Charles Genet, and that is the ambassador to the U.S. And then, by the way, this is the fear of the political so-called anti-federalists who opposed the new taxes from increase the army. So the Alien and Sedition Act appeared from one side the first case in U.S. history to defend the free speech and the freedom of the press granted by the First Amendment of the Constitution. On the other, the first debate about the idea of representative democracy. During this period, representatives in the House were beaten. So the question remained on the ground. Which party is violent, rethinking the Judd's home destruction, burned to the ground by fire in South Carolina, and many other examples before you quoted?
Thank you very much, Marco. Je retiendrai également sur les plus...
So I will take away from what you have mentioned is the continuity and the historical precedence of violent phenomena and polarization of American society. Cole? I would like to talk about the deployment of federal troops within the United States, which is a very worrying phenomenon. The deployment of federal troops, first of all to Los Angeles this summer, and then to Washington, and currently to Chicago, and maybe tomorrow, we'll see, but maybe Portland in Oregon on the West Coast. For me, there is the desire to use the army inside the United States to demonstrate, to make demonstrations of force in American cities, and it demonstrates the profoundly authoritarian nature of the Trump administration, which is in power. There are no other words for this. We have an authoritarian president who is in command of the greatest world power. Why deploy the army inside the United States? We could look at the official reasons which are put forward by the administration. Trump says that the insecurity, which justifies the intervention of the army. However, when you listen to the people who live in these cities, that is not what they say. And that is not what the local police think of the situation. And it's not what the elected representatives think either. And that is an important point. We have the elected representatives of these big cities. There is a court case going on in terms of Chicago and Portland, and we'll see what the outcome of this will be. But for the moment, the local elected representatives are asking Trump to stop deploying their troops to their cities. And so we are in a form of very significant rupture with the practices of previous presidents, because historically, to go into more details, Trump wants to mobilize the National Guard. So these are the reserve forces of the army who normally intervene in natural disasters, and secondly, usually with the support of the governors of the states concerned. You need to go back to the 1960s to find another example where the president had sent the National Guard against the recommendations of the governors, and that was the context of a civil rights movement. So we had a Democratic president who wanted to support their governors against the segregationists from the south of the United States. So we have a president who is in direct confrontation with the elected representatives. So the question is always, well, why? So instead about speculating on Donald Trump's intentions, we can simply look at the outcomes of his administration since his return to power. We have a president who is constantly targeting his political adversaries and who is targeting potential sources of opposition. It is not my own opinion. You just have to look at the list of presidential decrees since January. So we have decrees against law firms who dared work on cases against Trump, decrees against the media. He wants to cut the state subsidies to public media, decrees against universities. When you look at the way the Republican Party talks about the opposition party, he considers them as enemies, so compromises are not possible. Stephen Miller, one of Donald Trump's main advisors, he says that the Democratic Party today is a terrorist organization. We have a little technical issue. We are hearing sound coming from another auditorium. Can something be done about this?
Vraiment, c'est bien plus intéressant ce qui se passe dans une autre salle. En tout cas, ce serait le message subliminal de la régie.
The subliminal message from the technicians is that what's going on in the next door room is a lot more important than what's going on here. I'm asking them to cut the speakers, which are giving us sound from another auditorium. So the technicians are working on it. Yeah. So the interpreters are not getting the sound from the speakers from the panel, so I'm afraid there's no interpretation possible for the moment until the technicians can solve that issue. Okay, sound is back. So when you look at what Stephen Miller says, he talks about good and evil. That's what was said at Charlie Kirk's funeral. He was murdered in Utah that we were mentioning earlier. So what do these big cities represent today in the United States in the Trump mindset? So Trump, who wants to target his opponents, who considers that you need to punish your opponents to target potential sources of opposition. Big cities are areas where people voted Democratic for the Democratic Party against, therefore, Donald Trump, where the elected representatives don't hesitate to criticize Donald Trump. So we have representatives who are starting to speak loud and clear. It's very much the case in Illinois and in Chicago at the moment. And these are also areas where the local authorities are often not coordinating their actions with the anti-immigration police, with ICE. And so in the Trump mindset, these are political adversaries that you need to punish. And the last point that I'd like to bring up is that we mustn't underestimate the importance of television. Donald Trump doesn't read, however, he watches a lot of television, especially Fox News, and you probably noticed how many Fox News personalities are now in his administration, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Transport and so on. And so Trump thinks in images, and so we'll see what happens, but potentially we will be able to demonstrate confrontations between the federal army, which embodies the will of the American people, at least of the MAGA people, represented by Donald Trump, against the Democrats who are incapable of controlling insecurity and who have demonstrations and who are anti-fascist and so on. So there is this staging which is very significant. So for all these reasons, this instrumentalization of the army is a rupture with the practices of previous presidents. And at the same time, the irony is that this was made possible by a Republican Party whose center of gravity has moved over the last few years. There is a radicalization of the Republican Party. So Donald Trump hasn't emerged from nowhere. He is the endpoint of this radicalization that I describe in my book. So rupture, yes, but at the same time, there is a progressive radicalization which has started a couple of decades ago. I will take away from this the fragmentation, the fault lines between elected representatives and a population on one side and federal power on the other side, which with this instrumentalization of the armed forces, which are normally meant for foreign affairs and are now being turned towards domestic affairs, and it embodies the authoritarian aspect of Trump's presidency. For this second question, I'd like to go into the culture wars and how these culture wars shape and are at work in American political life, and whether, I'll start with you, Cole, whether they are a symptom or a driver of all this phenomenon which has exploded over the last few years? Excellent question. I will answer it. But first, what do we mean by culture wars? There's supremacy in Italy, Germany at the start of the 20th century, but in the American context, it makes us think of James Davison Hunter's book in 1991. He wrote this book on culture wars, and what Hunter observed is that there were more and more conflicts around values in the United States. And when he was writing this at the start of the 1990s, he had in mind conflicts around the regulation of firearms, abortion, the role of religion in public space. these were issues about values for him. In fact, I think it's a bit more complex than that. I don't really like to use these definitions because the issue of abortion is also a social issue which concerns all of the female population. So we can't just reduce it to an issue of value. But when we think about values, we think about these societal conflicts which are not linked to the economy or to the distribution of wealth or to economic power, much more societal issues. There are more and more culture wars in the United States since the 1990s, and it's important to note here that the American right has always had the advantage in terms of culture wars, the Republican Party. It's because in the United States we have millions and millions of Americans who describe themselves as evangelical Christians. They are people who have a very personal relationship with God, who are born again, and these are millions and millions of people like this. But for them, the United States are going through, they truly consider that the United States are going through a profound spiritual crisis. And so for them, these are spiritual issues in the very literal sense of the word. So when they are involved in these culture wars, compromises are impossible. And these evangelicals are the drivers of these culture wars. Of course, now there are other culture wars. We started to mention them, the rights of trans people, the question of teaching. These are issues where Republicans are extremely mobilized. There's one thing that has changed, which is today they are in power. So this radicalized party, which is supported by an evangelical Christian base, which had always existed but used to be marginal. But today, this evangelical base is at the center of the political movement. They have progressively extended their influence over the Republican Party, and today they have their president who is in power, and so they have a lot more influence than previously. And so the last point that I wanted to add is that when we talk about the states, we talk a lot about social media, and we need to talk about this. And I will come back again to television, which is very important because we have a channel in the United States which is very important in the transmission of these culture wars. To use a media studies term for this, or communication studies, they are doing agenda setting. They will tell the TV viewers what are the important topics. There's Fox News, which was founded by Rupert Murdoch, both right-wing Australian-British mogul, and he will emphasize these culture wars. Fox News is a channel which does very well. It's not just the question of the content. They have a particular style and how they emphasize this opposition between ordinary Americans. The presenters position themselves on the side of everyday Americans, and they criticize the work of more prestigious media which are linked to the cultural elites. So Fox News played an important role in the transmission of these culture wars and continues to play an important role today. Today, Fox News is watched by older Americans, more conservative Americans, but they are also the ones who vote the most. Older people vote more than younger people. So Fox News had played an important role. So to end and to finish answering the question, yes, culture wars, of course, contribute to polarization, because if Donald Trump and the Republicans today, their role is to fulfill the demands of their political base. They consider that the other camp isn't even legitimate. They are opponents, they're terrorists or people who support terrorism, and therefore, from that point of view, they don't want to make any concessions. They don't want to make compromises. So, of course, that contributes to this polarization because, and I will end on this, we must not forget that Donald Trump, despite his attempt to model a country in his own image, remains an unpopular president. He has 40% popularity. In France, that would make a president very popular, but from a an American point of view, he is an unpopular president. So there is an important base which you must not neglect. But at the same time, there are 60% of Americans who do not approve of him. And so when you only want to satisfy your base, of course, it encourages this form of polarization that you're mentioning.
Et merci d'avoir.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you for reminding us that the political context in France is competing with the American political context at the moment. I'm not sure we can be very proud of that in France, but it is true. Marco.
Stress on the cultural war abroad. And I will start with the tariff. That seems odd, but it works. Who has the power to raise tariff in the US? Not the president, but the Congress. That passage in the Constitution was created to avoid the so-called imperial presidency. The fear was to have a mad king, and then the next 18th of October would be the no king day in the United States. All the cities will arise against this. So, one example, above all, the duty to import the furniture from Europe. Now Trump asked 50%, and then it's completely crazy. Who will pay this money? The American people. But Trump isn't just trying to renegotiate trade relations also with Europe. He is waging a full-blown cultural war to redefine the continent's value, our values, and shift the political axis toward the radical right to this advantage. So according to a study by the European Council of Foreign Relations, Trump and the MAGA movement have twofold goal: to discredit European institutions and to strengthen their new right allies in various EU countries. The strategy is visible and resembles a reality show generated by Washington. Trump supporters and right-wing allies are waging an ideological battle over migration, as I said before, but also minority rights, freedom of expression, and climate, finally. But there is also a behind-the-scene plan. Trump aims to humiliate Europe, portraying it as a dependent, weak, and not able to acting without America. He said this at the United Nations speech. And often, say European Council of Foreign Relations, EU leaders let him do this, except France, absolutely. From Germany to Poland, from Hungary to Italy, Trump's America actively supports far-right candidates. In 2025, Vice President Vance met with the leader of the German Alternative for Deutschland and attacked the EU from Munich just the day before crucial German election. They lost. The think tank Heritage, a Trump ally, hosted a workshop with Right Party in Hungary and Poland to propose to dismantling the EU Commission and the Court of Justice. Madame Meloni's case is demonstrative, looking at the death of Charlie Kirk, a white supremacist we told before, a pro-gun activist killed by a gun. As stated by Le Monde on September 28, Meloni hardens her rhetoric after killing of Kirk, embracing darker, more polarized themes, invoking conspiracies, and casting herself as a target of political violence. The very last example was in Prague, where the Czech Trumpist, the billionaire Andrej Babis, won the last election. So Trump's goals in this case is to reshape the EU as a European community of nations, an alliance of nation states without common constraint, central controls, or supernatural power. These plans aren't just ideological, they serve concrete interest. Attacking European rules means defending the profit of Musk, Tesla, Starlink, Zuckerberg's Meta, Bezos' Amazon, and the American gas supplier. When Trump called climate changes a con job, is representing these people, his billionaire friends, wrote Bernie Sanders. Climate change, said Bernie Sanders, representative at the Senate from Vermont, let's start with replanted forest. That cools the planet more, reducing greenhouse effect. That is my point in my very last book,
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Amy?
Oui, alors, sur la question de la guerre, enfin, des guerres culturelles aux États-Unis.
On the question of culture wars in the US, it's true that it is a very structuring element of the debate in the United States. I would like to emphasize 3 points. First of all, it's not a new phenomenon. We can see that the Americans are starting to look back to the 1970s with a process called the tripartisan process. What's starting to happen over the last 50 years or so is that the Americans have started to have more democratized access to higher education. In fact, at that time, what you observed was that the Americans started to be dispersed according to the economic opportunities, according to their diplomas. This means that you have large urban centers which attract these new economic talents who have the capacity to move from their local area, and this led to the construction of major centers on the two coasts. This meant that the rural areas began to be emptied. This started in the 1970s. So we had small rural communities lost all of these talents who went elsewhere, and developed elsewhere, and did not return. And so this created a dissonance, because on the one hand of these liberal and progressivist centers, and who tend to be more left-leaning, this means you have more and more people who decide to join these centers, otherwise, because they know they're going to find people who think in the same way as they do and have the same political leanings as well. And so in the end, we have these two Americas that are moving apart from each other. This is a very important point, because this is when the Americans start to no longer understand each other. This is a phenomenon which becomes worse and worse and is being now used by the politicians. Another important point is that we foresee the religious phenomena that you mentioned in your question, with one more recent phenomenon, which is very important, is the secularization of society. The first culture wars was around the question of abortion. This is a religious issue with the cancellation of the Roe v. Wade ruling became extremely important more recently. Then after that, it became a question of use of arms. So what I wanted to say is that it started with religious questions, which became broader issues and more political. So initially religious, and then becoming more broader and more political. So this goes together with the secularization of America, with the less and less Americans identifying with a particular church. And so there's a partisan division, because this phenomenon increased more on the left than on the right. At the same time, you have evangelicals, particularly on the right, who start to say they have more religious reading of the values of societies concerning abortion and also arms and individual rights, as opposed to collective rights. And the question of evangelism in the US is linked to religion, but increasingly it's a marker of our political identity. We have surveys and studies that show us that, in fact, evangelicals are more and more identified with the right of the Republican Party, which explains why they would vote Trump, even though he doesn't have much in common with this religious identity movement. At the same time, with this secularization can frighten this sector of American society. And then you have another element, which is the institutionalization of the culture wars. Because, in fact, this division, or these divisions within American public opinion on societal subjects, on certain subjects, there's not that much of a fracture. For example, on the right to abortions, most American people and most American women support a woman's right to choose if she wants an abortion or not. But in fact, in the states governed by the Republican Party, we see bills that will restrict or completely remove this right. So what we are going to see is that a kind of American two speeds. One America that governs in the name of these religious movements. They benefit from the power to govern these states, and so they will bring these bills into law to restrict abortion rights, which go against American public opinion. That's just a few ideas. There's another element I'd like to mention also, which is the demographic transformation taking place in the United States, which can also frighten some Americans. I'm not saying some Americans are afraid or frightened by this change, but they might underestimate it. When you bear in mind American history and the history of racism and civil rights and emancipatory movements, the fact is that today we are in we have a configuration of the American population where Americans no longer physically resemble the founding fathers. You have regions of the United States, such as in the South, where most of the population identify as being non-white. And so among the young generations, you have populations which are very different from previous generations. I'm not saying this is reflexive and it's the only driving force that nourishes these culture wars, but we shouldn't underestimate the transformations taking place in society, which no longer resembles what it looked like historically. Thank you very much, Amy. I think what we can take away from that in the heart of this culture war phenomenon, are several points that you've all mentioned, which is the importance of the media as an amplifier of the real situation in the US, the importance of the demographic factor of this American society, which now resembles the founding fathers in terms of demography. Also, the coming together of the politicians and religious movements is a decisive factor in the American society, highlighted by the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the way it's been handled. And also the importance of this evangelical movement, the born-again movement, which plays an important part in American society also. I would like to ask one more question, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. In my introduction, I said it's important when you look at the America to look at two key dates. The first one is a more short-term date, which is the midterms of 2026. But we also need to bear in mind the upcoming elections in 2028. We can already see the political positioning and the visions of the political parties. I'm talking specifically about the conservative political movements, which are not working in the short term in the second Trump term. Are also working with different candidates and also working on to develop the popularity of J.D. Vance and his appearances on the international scene, and his presence, which seems to be particularly significant in America compared to previous vice presidents. So according to you, in view of the time constraints we have, I'd like you to be as brief as possible so we have some time for questions from the audience. What do you think are the possible scenarios in the medium term, given these key dates, 2026 and 2028, for the upcoming elections? What do you think will be the scenarios in the political sphere? Marco, could we start with you?
Difficult moment in their history. I quoted before the Alien Sedition Act, 1798, but we have to think also the Red Scare in 1920s, where many of people would throw away the United States, as well as the McCarthyism during the 50s. It's a great fear of communism. And then other presidents brought civil guard into especially American university. You remember 5 deaths in Ohio in 74. So my answer, very brief, is I can say this is violence, but also resilience. So I trust the American dream, as the founders wrote the Constitution, and we will see.
Okay. Merci Marco. Je conserverai du coup le mot résilience.
Thank you, Marco. So you mentioned resilience, and you have faith in the American model to be able to overcome these difficulties. Amy, for 2026, the question will be, who will take control, keep control of the Congress? That's an important question. We know that with the current electoral maps, it's very unlikely that the Democratic Party would be able to take control of the Senate, because, as you know, in each political cycle, a third of the Senate is renewed. It's very much a staggered system. However, the 435 representatives are up for re-election. So we can see with the electoral maps, it's not certain that the Democratic Party will be able to take control of the Senate. It's more likely they'll be able to take control of the Congress. 30 of the 60 federal governors will also be up for election. So there will be important consequences there. If the Democrat Party wants to take over Congress, what sort of state will the Congress be in? Because we can see that Trump's ambition at the moment is to broaden presidential authority, which would go beyond the limits that would normally apply according to his, as established by his predecessors. So we may have a Congress that is weakened, with a justice system which may have validated this weakening of congressional power. So the question is, who is going to take control in what kind of situation? Today, it's true that we don't have many Democrat figures on a national level who are speaking out, but we shouldn't forget also that the midterm elections, above all, are local elections, especially for, and not so much for federal positions. This takes place in different constituencies. A few words about J.D. Vance. It's true that J.D. Vance is being positioned as a successor of Trump. He has an ideological background and has the constitutional knowledge to have a stronger anchoring of the Trumpist vision after Trump, and he's a relatively popular figure nationally. And he's also having to deal with the certain levels of unpopularity as well. But he's seen as the successor to Trump. Cole. I agree more or less with Amy, except on one point. I would say that the elections are local elections, but we're in a political context where everything is nationalized in a way. We have a political situation where everything is seen through the prism of Trump and his fight against the Democrat Party. It's true that they are local elections, but they very much influenced by the fact that Trump is the president. Otherwise, the Democrats, the opposition, are achieving they normally achieve good scores in the midterms. Another point that might help the Democrats is that with the electoral reconfigurations, means the Democrats who tended to be more supported by the low-income groups. This has now changed. The Democrat voters now have more qualifications. They are wealthier, and they tend to vote more in the midterms than in the low-income groups. So paradoxically, that might be something that could favor the Democrat Party, whereas the Trump electorate remains very much a more low-income group compared to people living in large cities. So that's something that could favor the Democrats. 2028 is a big question. Is there a Democrat figure to face Trump? We haven't talked too much about Democrats. I mentioned earlier the unpopularity of President Trump at the moment. If you look at the opinion polls, the Democrat figures are very critical of their own party. The Democrat Party is not very popular either, including among Democrats. They consider that the opposition has fallen asleep at the wheel and is not present and is not up to the fight. So the Democrats are going through an identity crisis with different ideological movements and also fractures in their opposition to Trump. So should they talk about authoritarianism of Trump or should they talk about questions such as inflation, of cost of living, or social problems, or whatever? So there's an identity crisis, I think, for the Democrats. Yes, I think we've even seen in the Democrat Party, we've seen major figures of the Democrat Party criticizing each other. So even in level of the leadership of the Democrat Party, doesn't really seem to be any agreed and common direction shared by these different movements within the Democratic Party. Even for electoral reasons, they don't want to frontally attack the Trump administration, and perhaps they don't want to use the same techniques that they criticize that are used by the Republicans. So this is very interesting. I'll hand over now to questions from the audience. If you could put them up on the screen, please. Okay. The first question is, American society seems to be multicultural and polarized. What is the cement of this society and what has changed? I will let you react to that one. Let me just turn around. I think there's something that has an impact on the idea of overcoming what favors the unifying of the American people, apart from the different values, is the addition to a common project. Compared to the past, we remember America, which put people on the moon and with their great scientific achievements, etc. It's true that there are always times of tremendous progress which pulled the Americans into the forefront of world history. I think another important thing is the American promise. For me, everybody has their own American dream, which is one of the fantastic thing about the country. For me, what I think is important is that you can start from a position of poverty and succeed thanks to your work. You can also give your children a better life thanks to your work as well. So it's almost like an economic pact. You invest in the collective community, and the community will reward you thanks to your own talents. You saw that you mentioned in your introduction the prism of social inequalities, which I talk about in my book. It's true that this dream is becoming less credible for an increasing number of Americans who today see the younger generations who, from the point of view of their life expectancy, are not living as long as their parents, in worse conditions than their parents as well. So this promise of social and economic success and social improvement is no longer the case. In fact, the social ascension is quicker in France than it is in the US. This is what surprised me when I was preparing my book. The younger generations in America are finding it more difficult to get out of poverty now. So we have a bipolar system which structures the conflicts. That's the democratic process. That is conflict, and that's perfectly normal. Here we are reaching a high level of polarization. We shouldn't underestimate the breaking down of this socio-economic process as a driving force and a unifying force for all Americans in their individual identity. They are participating in this collective project. I think there is one important point to understand about the America today, or even in the past, is the role of trade unions, which is very important to understand both the high level of standard of living after the Second World War, but which also explains the kind of political reconfiguration. One of the advantages of being a journalist in the field is that when I was in West Virginia, a state which was Democrat until the 1990s, which then switched over to Republican. When you ask people in West Virginia, which is a very poor and white state, where at the time there were big coal mines at the time, when you talk to people, say, why have people, and ask why people have stopped voting Democrat, whereas it was a state that used to be Democrat, they would say to me, it's often linked to the trade unions. It's the decline of trade unions. Their trade unions played a unifying role in the community, in the communities, in these villages and towns where the trade unions offered not only guaranteed a better standard of living for employees. I don't have time to go into detail about all the details of American trade unions, which are very different from France. But to just be very brief, in the US, if you don't have a trade union, if you're not a member of a trade union, you're not allowed to negotiate with your employer. So the trade unions negotiate in the name of all of the employees. Just after the Second World War, we had the membership level of trade unions with 35% of all the employees. Today it's less than 10%. That means that 9 employees out of 10 don't have the right to negotiate with their employer. I don't know if you realize how significant that is. So the trade unions not only guaranteed a better standard of living, but they also conveyed values, anti-racism, more progressive values. And so the trade unions played a very important role. So that is one aspect that... we have the voice from the screen that is coming back. Could we turn the screen off, please? We have the sound from the other room again. I'll try to carry on speaking nevertheless. And as you said, Marie-Caroline, we have the beginning of a renewal of American trade unionism. We are seeing a slight increase in number of people joining trade unions in the US, especially at Starbucks. We have about 100 Starbucks shops where they have voted to have a trade union, and also in Amazon, which is one of the biggest employers in the US. This is a question I ask, and other people are asking these questions. Perhaps this small renewal of trade union membership in 10 or 20 years' time, perhaps that could rebalance things in American society and have a better redistribution of wealth in this country, which is very inegalitarian.
Absolutely. I think that during these discussions, we've talked a lot about cultural wars, which is inherent in American society. And Cole, I'm glad you've been able to talk more about the socio-economic aspect, which of course is always a fundamental factor of polarization of American society, and the role played by trade unions that you talk about in your first book, which is definitely something that we need to monitor closely in American society. It's a question about how is big tech responding to this societal rupture and this political polarization? And also a second question, given what was said by way of introduction, can we still call the United States a liberal democracy, or should we now use a new term? I'll let you choose the question that you'd like to answer.
Soit les GAFAM ou la question de...
Either about big tech or the United States as a liberal democracy.
I said something about the GAFAM before, and then how Trump was trying to protect this GAFAM here in Europe. And this is the theme, just to protect GAFAM from all over the world, and except China that invented this method, and Russia too. So in this case, I can say that Trump asked the GAFAM, what did you do for your country? And then answer, I gave millions, and then they're very, very close. I consider GAFAM very, very close to the contemporary presidency of Trump. That is my point of view.
Merci, merci Marco. Peut-être
Thank you, Marco. Maybe Amy or Cole about the issue of whether we can still call the United States a liberal democracy. The Americans in 2024 didn't vote to end the institutions and end liberal democracy. We could do an autopsy of that election, but it was just as much a vote of support with regards to Donald Trump's policies. And there was this anger which was expressed and which was expressed in the ballot box. They say that they were told that everything was going to cave in, but it didn't. And so we end up with a polarized electorate. So if I feel that I've been let down by one side of the extreme, then I'll go towards the other extreme. So in Donald Trump's policies, we see that they go very far on a certain number of issues which were not at all talked about during the election, which was all about other things, the international weakness. Joe Biden didn't manage to solve various wars or to prevent various wars, a weakness at their borders because of immigration, and weakness on a domestic level because the Democratic Party wasn't able to alleviate the economic precarity or vulnerability which is experienced in American homes. And so Trump gave lots of proposals, and there wasn't really the issue of the defense of liberal democracy or the end of liberal democracy. That leads us to the next question. During the midterm elections, will voters feel bitter about the economic performance of this presidency? Will they consider that the deployment of troops in democratic cities is one step too far? Maybe or maybe not, because actually this is something which pleases a lot of Americans, especially those who live in very tense environments, and they think to themselves, oh, it would be nice if we could also have some help in our cities. So the other question is whether Americans will consider that their president has perhaps restored American prestige around the world. This remains to be seen. But if everything is for or against Trump, that minimizes the fact that there are nevertheless left-wing elected representatives who defend left-wing values. And when the Democratic Party said, well, there will no longer be a democracy in a few years' time if you vote for Trump, it only resonated with Democratic voters. And so in terms of the defense of individual liberties, I don't think we have exited from this framework in the United States. Thank you, Amy. Can I add something, Cole? I agree. The system is such. But I remind you that we have a political party in power which is not a party which accepts the principles of liberal democracy. We must not forget this. It is a party which tried to topple the results of the previous elections in 2020. We haven't talked about the attempted coup d'etat on the 6th of January organized by the current president. It is a party which is in difficulty with a certain number of democratic principles. We must not neglect something else. Of course, as Amy says, we mustn't carry on doing the autopsy of the 2024 campaign. But when you vote for Donald Trump in 2024, even if this is a harsh reality for a certain number of Americans, but when someone votes for Trump in 2024, yes, Trump campaigned on economic issues. Yes, he talked about inflation, but you cannot say they're not informed about a certain number of xenophobic extremes or racist extremes, excesses, to be diplomatic about it. You cannot say that you were not aware of this. So when you vote for Donald Trump, there comes a point where you have to be responsible. I know that it is a harsh reality for some people, but we mustn't neglect the the importance of the passion which Donald Trump inspired, and the way he made the most of divisions within society and ethnic divisions, racism. Those divisions, that's also a Republican strategy, which is nothing new, which has been put to the test, often in more subtle ways by other Republican candidates. We could even talk about President Reagan, who, in a speech in 1980, starts his campaign. He talks about the states' rights in a southern county in Mississippi, a southern state, which was historically a segregationist state. So it is also a reminder of these very reactionary currents. We mustn't just underestimate this profoundly reactionary aspect that Donald Trump embodies. Those people who voted for him knew what he represented. That needs to be noted. And the opposition party, the Democratic Party, it is up to them to demonstrate an alternative. For now, even the Democratic voters don't know what the Democratic Party represents. What is their positioning? And they are remaining defensive today, and more than on focused on building a program which could bring together their electorates, not even talking about growing the electorate, but just maintaining the traditional democratic voters within the party. There was a question which I can't see on the screen anymore, which seemed particularly interesting, and I will then add my own question before ending the session. It's how we can reconcile these two Americas which no longer tolerate or understand each other. And there is a last request. If each one of you needed to identify a single factor, whether it is sociological or other, sociological, religious, cultural, economic, institutional, or any other, which is profoundly structures the American mindset, what is it? Is there any optimism? Can we reconcile these two Americas? And second point, what are the major fundamental structuring factors? Cole. Well, first, let's start with the first question. I'll start with the Democratic Party, opposition party faced with an authoritarian party. You need to look at the past. When the Democrats, when did they really win elections? You can go back to Roosevelt. That is a perfect example of this big democratic coalition which managed to win power. Why were you voting Democrat after Franklin Roosevelt? Well, after the 1930s, we knew that when the Democrats were in power with the New Deal, that things would go better from an economic point of view. Roosevelt is the party which started the minimum federal wage, which its social advances. Things were going better. So the Democratic Party was associated with an improvement in Americans' living conditions, which is very far removed from the current Democratic Party. You can also talk about Johnson's presidency in the 1960s, where he was implementing real policies which improved Americans' living conditions. So the Democratic Party needs to arrive in power, that they need to implement a program and show that they are able to improve things. I agree with Amy. It's not by talking only of the importance of liberal democracy that the Democrats are going to win, because the Americans wonder what democracy and why. The Democratic Party needs to offer something. There are some interesting candidates at the moment. To give you examples, there is a young socialist in New York who won the Democratic primary, who might become New York's next mayor, Mamdani. Then in the interesting candidates in the main, Graham Partner, a Democrat who is a veteran. A very populist campaign, Bernie Sanders style. So they're the people against the economic elites. And we can also talk about a candidate in Nebraska, Dan Oswald, on a former trade unionist, who is not actually a Democrat, but is presenting himself against the Republicans. That's the first point. And the second, the structuring factor. The main structuring factor of American society: religious, socioeconomic, cultural, institutional. The answer is easy. It's to say that Trump's coalition, it's a true coalition, is not a single factor. When you have the big tech bosses and a certain number of Silicon Valley oligarchs who support them, they also have the sovereignists like J.D. Vance, who want a more commercial war to defend American industry. But also I'd like to emphasize, as we mentioned earlier, these evangelical Christians who are very important, because I really emphasize the religious aspect. We saw it at Charlie Kirk's funeral. It's extremely important, and there's something very interesting that happened at the funeral. We could say that Donald Trump, he's not a good Christian. Let's say that, to be diplomatic. He's divorced. He bought the silence of a porn star. So from a Christian point of view, he's not exactly an ideal. At the same time, what is very important to understand in the MAGA world, and I've seen it in my own eyes as a journalist, talking with Republicans in evangelical bastions, they consider Donald Trump as a kind of biblical persona, like David, someone who has sinned, who has been in excesses, but who is nevertheless someone who was able to lead his people. And Trump has played on this biblical persona. Even at the Charlie Kirk's funeral, a very powerful moment where Charlie Kirk's widow takes the microphone and says, "I forgive the murderer." That's very much an example of what it is to be a Christian. And Donald Trump takes over right after and says, "Unfortunately, I don't agree with you. I hate my opponents." And we could say that's shocking and it's ironic, but in the MAGA world, Trump is playing his role. He's the King David. And so I know this can be shocking. Why am I talking so much about religion? Well, to understand this MAGA, Make America Great Again, we need to understand the importance of religion, which is very much the cement of this coalition. Yes, a crystallization of the religious and the political. Marco?
Is that Trump is fragile, especially in the economy. Everything he touched failed on plenty of things. He got the vodka, he got the airlines, he got plenty of jobs in the past, and he failed. So he was not able to understand the multi-ethnicity of the American society. And the very end, this is the society that brought the success of America in the past and also today. Not to remember as you did Roosevelt, but Roosevelt was in charge to change the American lives during the New Deal. So I think considering in the history, America is a multiracial society, and the election of Barack Obama, remember this, the first American president, and was the president who carried on Obamacare. That is the tragic fate for the American people. And then we will remember Trump for his white supremacy attitude and internal wars against the American people.
Thank you, Marco. Amy, quelques mots?
Thank you, Marco. You talked not so much about Trump, but about American society. For me, the structuring factor is the absence of a common truth. I think this is something that structures political and civic life in America. It's important to understand this. And optimism, it's slightly fake, but in order to bring Americans together around a common issue, today every individual is increasingly suffering in their own personal lives, health, weapons, and socio-economic realities, without realizing necessarily that their neighbors are going through the same thing, that they're in their community. A lot of other neighbors are living the same thing, and in the next neighboring state, so on and so forth. So the optimism would be around federating Americans around something, is to realize that this precarity, these difficulties, these worries, and this fear, not singular to them, but through policies, through federated states. It's sad, but it is a reality of in the lives of ordinary Americans today. Thank you, Amy. And I thank our three panelists for these discussions. Thank you for your attention. I remind you that the two books written recently by our two panelists, Cole's books and Amy's books, are available at the Charlemagne bookstore just outside this auditorium. Thank you.